Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're continuing our study of the Gospel of Luke. Last time we looked at an outline of the Gospel of Luke from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 24, and we noticed that the pivotal point in the middle is when Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. That before this, we've been asking the question of who is Jesus? The ministry has taken place for the most part in Galilee, about 2.5 years. I could be off either way, could be a little bit more, could be a little bit less. There was a focus there mostly on the miracles, sometimes on the teachings, but mostly on the miracles of Jesus. And then after that, what we're going to look at in this section are the parables, those long story parables amidst the teachings of Jesus as he's on his way to Jerusalem. Let's look at verse 51 that kicks this off. Luke 9:51, when the days were approaching for his ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him, but they did not receive him. That is, the Samaritans did not receive him because he was traveling toward Jerusalem. When his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" I can't help but wonder if this is where they get their nickname. Jesus later on calls them the sons of thunder. Perhaps this is where they get that name from. Verse 55, but he turned and rebuked them and said, "You don't know what kind of spirit you are of." Now, some Greek texts don't have that line in here. That's why it's in italics. It might have been the original text. I don't know if it was, but it wasn't in a number of manuscripts. But then what is in every manuscript, verse 56, he goes on to explain, "For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And that's going to be the big idea that Luke will take us to now. He's the Son of Man who is, yes, he's a teacher, but the Son of Man who came to save. And they went on to another village as they're beginning now to work their way south, eventually to Jericho, and from there to Jerusalem. As Jesus travels to Jerusalem, we're moving into that section of the long story parables. And so I want to talk about the three kinds of parables that we're going to see here. First of all, there are the riddle parables. The riddle parables are given to hide truth. They are given so that God's people get it, but those who were not God's people are going to miss it. And sometimes the ones that are God's people actually have to come and say, "What did you mean by that? Can you explain that a little further?" And so sometimes they will come with answers attached. But these are riddle parables. Secondly, there are example parables. Now, example parables are telling you to go and follow this example, or sometimes go and don't follow that example because that's going to be a bad example. And we'll see examples of both kind of example parables. We'll see some go and do like this, and we'll see some that go and don't do that. And then the third are challenge parables. A challenge parable is a parable that challenges us to think, to discuss, to argue, maybe even to wrestle with the truth, because we're going to see some parables where halfway through the story goes in a way that we're not expecting it to, and you say, "What can that mean?" And notice there's a little bit of riddle in that, but the intent is not to hide the truth. The intent is to bring you through it and to have you wrestle a bit with the truth. We begin with the parable of the Good Samaritan, but to get the parable of the Good Samaritan, and this is true with most of these long story parables, you have to begin with the story that leads up to the parable. And in this case, it's when a man comes to Jesus with a question. It's a legal question. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, well, start with love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And the man says, "Okay, I'm okay with loving God. I can do that, but I'm not sure I like the open-ended question about loving my neighbor. Who is my neighbor?" I almost get the sense that he's looking for loopholes, and so Jesus responds with a parable. And you're familiar with a parable where a man unnamed is going from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he is beset upon by robbers and left for dead, all injured, and a priest comes by and passes by but doesn't help him. just continues on his way. And a Levite comes by and doesn't help him and continues on his way. Here are two people with all their religiousness. There's no practical religion. And now a Samaritan comes by. And the Samaritans and the Jewish people didn't normally get along. But the Samaritan stops and helps him. And in fact, not only helps him, but takes him along back to an inn and pays for his upkeep and cares for him. And the question, okay, who acted as a neighbor? And it was evident, you don't have to think too hard, the one who helped him. And Jesus says, you go do the same thing. Now, what's interesting is that story ought to perhaps be familiar to somebody that was well-versed in the Old Testament. Way back in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, there was a historical story, it really happened, where the kingdom of Judah had gone to war against the kingdom of Israel, that is the kingdom where Samaria had its capital. So it was the Jews against the Samaritans, and the Jews had lost, and they had gotten really badly beat up, and the Samaritans said, good, we can just take them all into captivity. And a prophet had said, no, they are your brothers. You take care of them accordingly. And so what did they do? They patched up the wounded. Now, and here's the connection. And they put them on beasts of burden and took them down to Jericho. When you hear Jericho, you're supposed to sort of be reminded of that. And saw them eventually safely home. Now that story is in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, the first part of the chapter. Look at that sometime. I think Jesus is actually taking that story, changing some of the details, but leaving enough for you to recognize it, and then applying it to the situation. And then after this, you've got the story of two sisters, where the Mary Martha story. And again, there's the question that's asked, Lord, Martha says, I'm doing all the work in here. Isn't it right for can't you tell Mary to come in and help? And Jesus gives an evaluation here. No, Mary has chosen the better part. And so you have to see these three stories. They are all interconnected about being a neighbor, but also about loving God. You see, that was the question. What shall I do to inherit eternal life? Love God and love your neighbor. So we've got a story about the neighbor, and then we've got a story about loving God. Chapter 12, verse 16, and he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? And who's planning for the future. And then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and then I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come, a long retirement. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. The moral of the story, the teaching of the story, prepare for the future, yes, but prepare by giving riches to the Lord, not to your retirement fund. He is the ultimate, the eternal retirement fund. Next, we have stories about living in readiness. Luke chapter 12, verse 35. Be dressed in readiness and keep your lamps lit. Now, this is continuing that same theme. Be like men who are waiting for their master when he returns from the wedding feast, so that they may immediately open the door to him when he comes and knocks. So notice, it's people who are waiting, but notice how the situation of a wedding feast is thrown in. These are maybe elements that make up segments of a multifaceted parable. And Luke does this on a number of occasions, where there's a main lesson, but there are also some minor lessons along the way. And so he continues, verse 37, blessed are those slaves whom the master will find on the alert when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will gird himself to serve. Now, here is the sort of the riddle form of this parable. Here's where the parable is turned on its ear. It's turned completely upside down, because masters do not gird themselves to serve the slaves. And notice, here the master comes back, And the slaves are waiting to serve the master, but instead, the master girds himself to serve and have them, the slaves, recline at the table and will come and wait on them. That's not the way it's supposed to happen. Verse 38, whether he comes in the second watch or even in the third and finds them so, blessed are those, and the idea is those slaves. Verse 39, but be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, notice how we've changed stories. Instead of a master coming home, it's the thief coming to rob. If he had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. And the point is the same in both stories. You too, here it is, be ready. It's a call to readiness, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. Now we have chapter 12, verse 35. These watchful slaves we've just looked at, they're waiting for the coming of the master of the wedding feast. That's a good thing. That's a joyful occasion. They don't know exactly when the master's coming. And then, by contrast, we saw the watchful head of the house waiting for the coming of the thief. That's a bad occasion. That's sorrowful. You don't want thieves to come. And the head of the house doesn't know when the thief is coming. And the lesson from both places is the same. Be ready, be watchful, because you don't know when it's going to take place. Verse 41, Peter said, Lord, are you addressing this parable to us or to everyone else as well? Is that for us? Are we supposed to study for this for the test? Or is this to everyone else? Who are the insides and who are the outer, the ones on the outside with regards to this parable? And the Lord said, well, you tell me, who then is the faithful and sensible steward, whom his master will put in charge of his servants? In other words, Peter, you get to decide. Where are you going to be in the story? Are you going to be the faithful and sensible steward to give them their rations at the proper time? Blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Don't ask me, ask yourself. Verse 44, truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that slave says in his heart, my master will be a long time in coming, and begins to beat the slaves, both men and women, to eat and drink and get drunk. In other words, if instead of being a proper servant, if he tries to be a overbearing leader, then he gets into, it's a very different case. Verse 46, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. Peter's wanting to know, does this apply to him? Jesus says, you get to decide which way it applies to you. Are you going to be a faithful slave, or are you going to be an unfaithful, overbearing? You're still a slave, but you're trying to act as if you were not. Verse 47, and that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accord with his will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. Notice that there is a liability in knowing. From everyone who has been given much, much will be required, and to whom they entrusted much. And Peter was asking, but Peter was entrusted with a lot. And therefore, he's being held responsible for a lot. If you're listening to this, let me just say, you have been entrusted with a lot. You know the story of Jesus. You're not like those, sometimes I'm asked, what about those who have never heard? Well, that's not the case with you because you've heard. And so therefore you are responsible for that much more. So you have the faithful steward versus the unfaithful steward. The faithful steward follows the instructions of the master. The unfaithful steward, there are those that knew the master's will but did not. They didn't follow it. But also there's those that did not know the master's will and they didn't follow it because they didn't know what it was. So the faithful steward is put in charge of all the master's possessions. The unfaithful steward who did know but didn't follow, he receives many lashes. The one who did not know, he still receives lashes, but they are fewer in number. Now we come to Luke chapter 13. And the question here is asked, what about those who died in tragic circumstances? And there were a few situations where people had died. There were people who Pilate had killed. They'd gone to worship, and he had mixed their blood with the sacrifices. In other words, instead of worshiping, their own blood had been shed there in the temple. Or there had been another instance where a big tower had just fallen and killed a bunch of people. So one was a political disaster, and one was what we could call a natural disaster. And in both cases, Jesus says, don't think that the people that died there were especially bad, but your takeaway can be, unless you repent, you will also perish. And then he gives the parable of the fig tree. And in the parable of the fig tree, he's pointing out that fruitfulness is required. God requires fruit. God requires faithfulness. And as he's in the tree, he's planted. There's a tree. There's a vineyard. He came looking for fruit. That's actually borrowed from an Old Testament parable way back in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 5. So it's a familiar story, but Jesus is taking that and applying it not just to Israel, but to everyone. You see, he's taking it and expanding on the parable. And then beginning in verse 10, he's teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there's a woman there for 18 years. She's had a sickness caused by a spirit, and she's been bent double and not able to straighten up. It's caused her posture to be deformed, and he sees her and he calls her over and he heals her. And so, but it's the Sabbath day, and that's the issue. And the synagogue official sees that Jesus is healed on the Sabbath, and he says, "Well, that's just not right. There's something wrong with that." And Jesus rebukes the synagogue official because he says, "Well, wait a minute. She is, this isn't just out and out working. I have set her free. I have liberated her, and the Sabbath is a great time to be liberated because Satan has bound her, and Satan today has been defeated." Yeah, Satan has bound her for 18 years. Should she not have been released? In fact, it's appropriate for the Sabbath to be a day of relief, a day of release. And she has found her relief and her release on this day. Next, we have two parables of the kingdom. Parable of how a little tiny seed is taken. You see, we had that first parable about a tree. This is a parable of a tree as well. A little tiny seed falls and grows and turns into a great tree. And the birds of the air nestle in its branches. And by the way, when he says that, again, that's a quote. That's a figure of speech from the Old Testament. It's an Old Testament parable that Jesus is borrowing again. And then parable number 2 is that of leaven. It only takes a little bit of leaven to influence the whole bread. And so both of these parables of the kingdom, something small grows to get very big. Something small, a little bit of leaven, goes to influence the entire loaf of bread. And now the question is asked, verse 23, are there just going to be a few who are saved? And Jesus, in answering it, instead of saying, yeah, there's only going to be this much, Jesus says, assuming that's true, strive to be one of those few. Strive to be one of those who goes through the narrow door, because many will seek and not be able. And so you focus on what is important. We come to chapter 14. This is full of dinner parables. And we begin, again, there's a Sabbath healing that takes place in the first 6 verses, where he comes into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees. And in this case, there's one suffering from dropsy. And Jesus actually asked the question, is it lawful, is it permitted to heal on the Sabbath? And and they're not sure they want to answer after having heard perhaps what happened in chapter 13. Um, and remember, when you're talking about healing on the Sabbath, the fact that he's able to heal, that's a sign that God's at work. Does God work on the Sabbath? Well, there's a sense in which God stopped working on the original Sabbath, but God still causes the rain to fall and crops to grow. God still does things on the Sabbath, and that's the point that is being made. And so Jesus now begins to give some what we could call party teachings, uh, and it's all based upon the fact that they're at a party, they're at a dinner party, and so in verse 7, he says, he looks at the way they're picking out who's going to sit where, and people are looking to sit in a better place. And Jesus says, when you come to invite it, don't go looking for the best place, because if you do, you might be told, hey, that's reserved for somebody else. And we're not just talking about parties and seating, we're talking about how to live. Don't try to necessarily elevate yourself, because life has a way of knocking you down and telling you, no, you've pushed yourself beyond what's appropriate. Instead, take a position of humility, and that way God can lift you up. And then likewise, he gives a second teaching about who to invite when you're inviting somebody to dinner. Don't go inviting those who are wealthy that you can impress, and they'll turn around and invite you. And you do something nice for them, they'll do something nice for you. But instead, invite the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind. And it's interesting how those people are going to be mentioned again later on in this same chapter, because he tells a parable now of somebody who's giving a big dinner, and he's invited, all sorts of people, and now they come back with excuses. Well, I can't go because I've got this thing that came up, or I've got that thing came up, and his dinner invitations come back. Nobody's coming to his dinner. And so he says, the owner of the household said to the slave who is in charge of taking the invitations, he says, go out into the streets and lanes of the city and bring here, and it's the same group we mentioned before, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. That's in verse 21. They'd been mentioned first in verse 13. And the slave does that, and he says, okay, I've invited them. There's still room. And now the master says, I want you to go, not just getting the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame, but now go into the highways, along the hedges, the outsiders, the people that aren't us, and bring them in. So notice that there's both the down and out, and then there's the out and away, and they are all brought in. And he says in verse 24, for I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste of my dinner. And so the invitation that had first been offered is now brought back in. And because they missed it, now they have missed out. Next, there are some parables about planning ahead, beginning in verse 25, where he talks about if somebody comes, he has to come wholeheartedly. In fact, he says this in such a way: if anyone comes to me and does not, and this sounds strong, he's speaking in sort of a superlative. If someone comes and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. That my disciples are those who give their all to me. And then he gives some examples of this, of somebody who is getting ready to build, but he hasn't counted the cost. This whole idea of counting the cost, or of a king that's going to war. And he says, well, wait a minute. I had to look first to see if I can actually win this war. He counts the cost. He looks at how many soldiers he has and how many soldiers the enemy has. And so then again, he says in verse 33, so then none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all of his own possessions. And it's a warning. Count the cost before you come. Are you really in it all the way? Or are you just dabbling in religion? Chapter 15, we have a series of stories about things that are lost and found. Jesus tells a parable about a man who's lost a sheep, and he's got 100 sheep, but he's lost one, and he goes and looks for the one until he finds it. Or a woman who has lost a coin, and she's got a whole bunch of coins, maybe 10 coins, but she's lost one, and she turns everything upside down until she's found that one. Now, she still had the others, but it's searching for that which is lost. And now Jesus tells the longer story parable that we call it the parable of the prodigal son. It's about a son who is lost. Actually, it's about two sons who were lost, but one doesn't know it. And the younger son has gone off, and he has spent his father's inheritance. And there's all sorts of cultural background. Not going to get into that right now. But in the same way that the shepherd looking for the lost sheep and the woman looking for the lost coin, when it's found, there's rejoicing. So also this lost son, this younger son who has spent his father's inheritance out on just his own sorts of things. When he loses it all, he comes back, and the father is there waiting, and the father brings him in. And when he returns, the father throws a party, and it's wonderful. But there's also the older brother. And the older brother takes issue with it when he finds out, wait a minute, there's a party going on for this, this no good brother of mine who went out and lost my father's inheritance. And he doesn't want to come. And the father now goes out to him and he asks him the question, um, uh, son, you've always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. And you say, well, what did the older brother do? And we're not told. The father puts this charge to the older brother. We have to rejoice. And you're not told his response, because you are the older brother. The question is, what are you going to do when the one who is unworthy is brought into the kingdom? When the one who is unworthy of forgiveness is forgiven, what will be your response? And so it's a challenge parable. It's a challenge to you in the position of the older brother. By the way, if you're in the position of the younger brother, you have a promise of the Father's love. If you're a position in the older brother, maybe you've been faithful, and you look at people who have just done some bad things and are forgiven by God. It's a call for you to act like the Father and to forgive the way the Father forgives, to rejoice in the one who comes back. So you have the younger brother, he had left home. The older brother, he had stayed home. The younger brother is the prodigal son. The older brother sees himself as the productive son. The real question, does he have the father's heart? The younger brother no longer felt worthy of his father's blessings, and so he comes back. He actually has a speech planned out where he's going to say, Father, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Let me maybe be one of your slaves. The older brother felt that the father owed him these blessings. After all, he's been there to be faithful. The younger brother had realized his sins. The older brother had an attitude of self-righteousness. The younger brother repented. The older brother, up to the point we see him, has resented. And the question is, what's going to be his continuing attitude? Will he repent as well? We come to chapter 16, and now we have some money parables. We begin in chapter 16 and verse 1. Now he was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be a manager. So here's somebody who's sort of the money man for the person who owned it all. and he's told he's going to get fired. And the manager said to himself, "What shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes." And he concocts a plan, and frankly, it's a dishonest plan. Verse 5, and he summoned each one of his master's debtors. And he began saying to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measurements of oil. And he said, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50." He's going to cut his debt in half at the expense of the master. Verse 7, then he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill, write 80. That's dishonest. Verse 8, now here's the puzzling part. His master praised the unrighteous manager, not because of his unrighteousness, not because of his cheating, but because he had acted shrewdly. He thought ahead. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. You see, people today in this age, they plan for the future. They plan, how can I get the most for my dollar? But do we get the most for our dollar? Or are we just trying to spend it on the things that will only be in this life? Verse 9, Jesus says, "And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings." Plan ahead, not just in this life, but in the life to come. Then you are really planning ahead. So notice the correlation between finances and the kingdom. Here is someone who's been entrusted with little. When it comes to the kingdom, we've been entrusted with much. Finances, money, is described here as unrighteous, and we use an Aramaic term. They just, instead of translating it, they just put the Aramaic word there, mammon. It just means money. But we have true riches that we're able to get. And if you're trying to just build your life around getting money, you're going to miss the true riches. Finances, that's that which belongs to another. You say, "Well, it's my money." Look on a dollar bill. Whose picture is it? It's not yours. It belongs to somebody else. In fact, it probably says something like "property of the United States government," or whichever government that money was printed for. But the kingdom is that which is given as your own. You get an inheritance in the kingdom if you come to the king in faith. In finances, you have a master. In the kingdom, you have master. And the truth is that you can't serve two masters. You're going to have to choose one. Either love one and hate the other, or hate this one and love the other. Who do you love? Verse 14, now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, notice how that connects to that story we've just seen, and it will connect to the next one as well. They were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him, and he said to them, "You are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God." What do you love? Verse 16, the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. And since that time, the gospel of the kingdom has been preached. And everyone, I think the Greek is perhaps not as clear as it could be. Everyone is forcing his way into it, forcing his way against it. Notice there's a conflict that's taking place. There's a conflict that's taking place. And the way you resolve the conflict is by what you love. And so we move on to a new parable. You see, up to this point, we've seen the parable of the unjust steward. Now there's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And it's still about what you do with your riches. In the parable of the unjust steward, we had the Pharisees, who were lovers of money. And here is the story of a rich man who's a lover of money. we had been told that the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. And you know the story of the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man, he has all there is to have. And Lazarus is this poor beggar who sits outside the gates, hoping maybe for some, when they take out the garbage, that he can get a little bit. He and the dogs that have gathered, and they're just sort of licking his sores, and it's a miserable plight. And when the rich man dies, and he dies and goes to a very bad place, and he's able, in the parable, this is just a parable after all, he's able to look across this great gulf and see Lazarus, who's also died, partying with Abraham. And he says, can you please send Lazarus to maybe dip his finger in some water and just put it on my tongue? No, can't do that. There's a great gulf. Well, can you at least send Lazarus or someone back to warn my brothers back on earth? No, that's not going to happen either. Because if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, you see, this is Old Testament teaching. This isn't just New Testament teachings. If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. Which is rather prophetic, because we're going to read about somebody who rises from the dead here in Luke's Gospel. Chapter 17, verse 1, he said to his disciples, it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung about his neck and he was thrown into the sea, than that he would cause one of these little ones to stumble. Be on your guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times, saying, I repent, forgive him. Notice we're called to forgive and to go on forgiving. Well, the apostles said to the Lord, they hear this about forgiveness, Lord, can you increase our faith? And the Lord said, if you had faith like a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and be planted in the sea, and it would obey you. You see, they're being told to forgive, and they're saying, we need faith to forgive. And he says, no, you just need faith. If you have even a little bit of faith, goes a long way. So notice their request, give us more faith, and then we'll be able to forgive like we ought to forgive. And Jesus responds with a parable of a slave who serves his master. And in this parable, the point is made that the master is not obligated to thank the slave. You know, when the master, maybe they've both been working and they come in at the end of the day, the slave's job is to go and feed the master, and the master, he just sits there and receives that which the slave gives. And then when the slave's done, the slave gets to go feed himself. And the master doesn't say, oh, I'm so glad you came and served me. No, the slave is doing what he's supposed to do. And the master is not obligated to thank the slave. And now Jesus acts out a living parable where there are 10 lepers. And they're calling out from afar because they're social distancing, and Jesus heals them. He says, go show yourself to the priest. That's what you do when you're healed of leprosy. And they start to leave, and they realize, wait a minute, we're healed. And one of them comes back to thank Jesus. So notice the thanking part. He's showing that Jesus is indeed the master as he returns to thank Jesus. And what does Jesus say to him? He speaks about his faith. Remember what the apostles have said? Give us more faith. And Jesus says to this Samaritan, your faith has made you whole. You see, there's a correlation between faith and thanksgiving. Chapter 18, verse 1, now he was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart, saying, in a certain city there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. A bad judge. Yeah, they had him back then. They have him today. 3, and there was a widow in that city. And she kept coming to him saying, give me legal protection from my opponent. So she comes to the judge asking for justice. Verse 4, for a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, even though I don't fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she'll wear me out. I'm tired of hearing her. So he gives her justice, not because he's just, but because she has persisted. The point of the parable, verse 6, and the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now will not God bring about justice for his elect who cry out to him day and night? And will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will bring about justice for them quickly. You see, God is a righteous judge. This is a parable by contrast. You have the unrighteous judge, and the woman keeps asking, and so the judge finally relents. We have the righteous judge. If you keep asking him, you're going to get an answer. Verse 8, I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find, remember how we talked about faith before? We're still there. Will he find faith on the earth? Are you going to be persistent, not only in your request, but in your faith? So you have the unjust judge, he's unrighteous. The Lord is righteous. The unjust judge doesn't really know the woman. The Lord knows us completely. The unjust judge, he doesn't care about the woman. The Lord cares about all creation. The unjust judge finally grants the needed help because of the woman's continuing request. And the Lord will not be slow, but will quickly grant justice to his chosen people, to his elect. Verse 9, and he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. It's always a dangerous thing. And viewed others with contempt. And here's the story. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, and the other a tax collector. So two people socially, politically, even spiritually, it would seem, were at opposite ends of the spectrum. A Pharisee and a tax collector. A Puritan and a bad person. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself. And here's his prayer. God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. In fact, I'm not like that. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. Now notice he's thanking God, but he thinks that he's okay. And meanwhile, the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. One thinks that he is acceptable before God and is not. The other one, in realizing his non-acceptance, comes for mercy and finds it. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. You see, when you go to the Lord Jesus, confessing, admitting your sin, your undeservedness, that is the essence of humility. Guys, can I tell you? I am undeserving of the grace of God. I need mercy. And it's only as a result of coming in humility, of coming in my own deservedness, that I can ever hope to receive mercy. That's the story of the one who came. That's the story of the cross. The one who came to save those who could not save themselves. And we'll look at the cross next time. We're going to stop here and continue on next time. So watch the rest of this video, and it will look at the death, the burial, but then the resurrection of Jesus.